Hello, Chipmunk and Chipette fans. My name is Grady Tamias, the speculative, evolved, upright walking chipmunk, and welcome back to another installment of Alvin and the Chipmunks Elaborations. Today's topic being why Bagdasarian Productions needs to bring back the concept of more chipmunk characters. So, way back in this channel's early days, I did a video about why there has been a lack of any chipmunk characters besides Alvin, Simon, Theodore, and the Chipettes in the franchise after the 80s and 90s era. I don't necessarily recommend going back and watching that video because, looking back on it now, I didn't really put it together very well. But to give you all the short and sweet version, I think that they stopped showing other chipmunk characters, like Vinny, Harry, the Chipmunks' grandfather, and the Tweet Tweet tribe, because Bagdasarian Productions may want to keep the story focus on the main 6 characters and not distract the audience with new chipmunks. And so character roles like that of Harry were instead filled by human characters like Ian Hawke. Basically, if they delved more into chipmunk kind in the shows or films, it would have made the main characters seem less special because they wouldn't be the only ones of their kind that we'd be privileged to see. And so why pay attention to these chipmunks like we have for over 6 decades when there's a whole world of possibilities with new chipmunks? Thus why they didn't appear in the live-action films or so far in the CGI series. Of course, they weren't in the Alvin show either, but really everything in the Ross Bagdasarian Sr. era was for the novelty of it all, so it didn't really matter. But while the later eras had more to do with charm and comedy, they also had some emphasis on the stories and life lessons, and so at least in the 80s era, there was a subtle but substantial amount of background lore. Some of it to do with the origin stories of the characters, and sometimes encounters with other chipmunks were what some episode plots revolved around. In the 2007 film, the Chipmunk Trio do mention their parents, but only passively. All they say is that they were hippies that left for a commune, and other than the presence of the Chipettes, we never hear a word suggesting that there are more of their kind out there in the rest of this film, or films 2, 3, and 4. In the CGI series, there's been a few instances where the characters acknowledge that they are chipmunks, but nothing definitive to say that other members of their species do exist. While I can't say if Bagdasarian's actual mentality towards non-main chipmunk characters is what I described earlier, I would like to propose a few counter-arguments to these reasons and explain why I think they should bring this idea back. First reason, the world of Alvin and the Chipmunks feels bleak without them. Due to a majority of the fanbase and general public being more familiar with the chipmunk media of the 21st century, where again, no other chipmunks are featured, there's been a common misconception that because we don't see any others, the main 6 that we see are the last of their species. Sure, this is a little presumptuous, and the target demographic of children aren't likely to come to this conclusion on their own, unless they were me when I was a child and had a decent grasp on the concept of extinction, but the portion of fans who keep spreading this rumor actually have a point. If they were as rare as what were shown, you'd think a wildlife conservation group would want to round them up and keep them somewhere safe until they can breed a large enough population to release them into their natural habitat. Such was the case in real life with animals like the whooping crane. Plus, if they were rare enough to be protected under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, Derek in the 2015 series would not be able to physically bully them like he does to Simon in the episode Bully for You. And in the episode Wacky Wednesday, he was even intent on fighting Alvin. Derek should probably be put behind bars anyway, but this would certainly do it for him. Even if you want to say none of that matters, it's a kid show, well, the main 6 would probably be pretty lonely not seeing any new faces like theirs for such a long time, and therefore the world would seem bleak from their perspective. I know the whole theme of the franchise is that they're sort of a found family because they're adopted, and so wouldn't be lonely because they have humans around, but this ties into something I'll talk about in reason number 3. Reason number 2. It gives the main characters a reason to be chipmunks. From a real-world perspective, the reason why Ross Bagdasarian Sr. made his creations chipmunks was because he encountered a chipmunk that dared to cross him in front of a road, and their squeaky sounds just so happened to be replicable with a special tape recorder that he had bought around that time. Like I said earlier, that was all for the novelty of it, and nowadays the excuse is just because chipmunks are cute and that's part of what makes their singing good or whatever. But from a narrative perspective, you still need to justify that, because in the CGI series, you could replace them with literally any other species, including humans, and the plot of every episode could stay the exact same. It turns out that these days, being a chipmunk just doesn't mean anything significant. A good way to resolve this issue and justify the main characters being chipmunks is by making the world of the series one where both humans and chipmunks coexist. You don't even have to dwell on the history of it. You could just say that the timeline played out as normal, like in the real world, just with chipmunks there in the background. Or that maybe chipmunks in human society is a relatively recent endeavor, or isolated mainly to Santa Barbara or whatever their town in California in the show is called. Now, in other franchises where they show multiple sapient species living in society or alongside humans, there's an occasional tendency to have stories that are analogous to interracial or interethnic conflicts. However, the concept doesn't necessarily incite those kinds of stories, at least not on its own, so despite the bullying thing I mentioned earlier, they don't need to go as far as making that an analogy for any kind of discrimination just based on the fact that the main characters are chipmunks. Because chipmunks would not be analogous to any specific human race, they're their own thing. Not to mention, those bullying instances that I talked about had nothing to do with difference in species. The reason for it happening was incidental school kid stuff. In fact, if they wanted to subvert this further, they could have other chipmunk students at their school and have them pick on Alvin, Simon, and Theodore for one episode. In any case, I predict that Bagdasarian and the TV censors would want to keep things tame if they ever wanted to take the human and chipmunk coexisting society approach, and that it wouldn't be necessary to use for storylines that border on controversial subjects like racial discrimination. I think Bagdasarian could make a pretty good story out of it if they were willing to take the risk, but all I'm saying is that a human and chipmunk society would not change anything about the series, at least in terms of tone. Though it would go a long way in helping the series make sense by defining why the characters we're following can only exist in this story as chipmunks. Really, the existence of talking chipmunks in the first place is the only thing the audience needs to suspend disbelief on, and even then, there's my chipmunk evolution hypothesis to explain that. Reason number 3. Having more chipmunks in the franchise would reinforce the life lessons that it's built upon. Like I said, the Alvin and the Chipmunks franchise operates around the theme that, to the main characters, Dave is their family, even though he adopted them. This was central to the first live-action film in 2007, and brought to its conclusion in Road Chip when Dave adopted them. Which I guess is all the more reason the film series is over. They thematically wrapped up that arc. But the franchise rarely ever touches upon the consequences of not appreciating the family that cares about you, regardless of whether or not they're actually related to you. The closest we ever got to that was back in the 80s special, A Chipmunk Reunion, where after the chipmunks found their biological mother, Vinny, Alvin couldn't accept that she abandoned them on Dave's doorstep, even though it was for the boys' own good and they otherwise would not have survived a food shortage and harsh winter. And this is something that happens in fiction a lot and in real life too. If an adopted child realizes that one of their biological parents is still alive, they'll try to find them and question why they were separated. But it's ultimately a path that does not end well, whether it turns out that their biological parents were not good people and didn't care about them, or had to separate from them for their own safety, or can't stay reunited because they have ties elsewhere. And this was a great life lesson for the episode to teach. Vinny wanted what was best for her children, even if it meant giving them up and not being able to fit into city life like them, even though she attempts that later in the series, but whatever. And by the end, Alvin gains a greater appreciation for his mother and Dave. Vinny may still be family with Alvin, Simon, and Theodore, but their ties are with Dave now and not so much her. If Vinny were to appear in the CGI series, I personally hope that she is portrayed faithfully to her 80s self, but regardless of whether she's the first non-main chipmunk character who gets introduced in the series, there's a moral question that can be explored just by having any new chipmunk character. If the Seville brothers or the Chipettes realize that there are more like them out there, they'd be tempted enough to want to look for them and try to do what they can to preserve their kind, unless they find like a massive amount of chipmunks proving that they aren't endangered, though I imagine with the show's budget they can only render a certain amount of new characters. And with that temptation and want to explore more about their own species, it could pull them apart from their connections with the humans, and they would find themselves with the moral question of, would you really set aside something about the ones who care about you just to preserve the ones related to you, or vice versa? Or in other words, which is more important, your kind or the kind that you live among and made you who you really are? I'm not saying go to Man of Steel or Transformers lengths where the main characters have to save humanity by fighting other members of their own kind, even though evil chipmunks who hate humans would be a cool raise of stakes in my opinion. But in the case of the CGI series, they could go another step by taking advantage of something fans have complained about with the humans for a long time. Recurring characters like Miss Smith, Derek, and many of the other humans on the show are written in situations to make you hate them, and while the show has made efforts to develop some of these characters, really Dave remains by default the most likable and is the one who shows the most amount of care towards the main six. While his potential has kind of been wasted throughout most of the series so far, something I'll elaborate on in a future video, he still embodies the franchise's meaning of family like his previous incarnations always have. And because he's the only human that seems to have any faith in the Chipmunks, while they get hated on by everyone else left and right, this would sway their feelings when other Chipmunks show up, because it also brings up the question of, is one human really enough to make them care more about their life in human society rather than their own species? And so there you have it, 3 reasons why the CGI Alvin and the Chipmunks series needs to bring back more chipmunks, and why it would be thematically appropriate to do so. Hopefully, if Bagdasarian decides to do this, they provide an explanation as to why we didn't see more chipmunks in the previous 5 seasons. But in any case, it does seem ever so more likely since they have teased the possibility of making an origin story episode. Oh, and one more bonus reason suggested by a friend of mine. I'm not going to show any pictures for this one for good reason. Adding more chipmunks would help the fan base become less toxic because, due to the aforementioned bleakness of there being so few chipmunks, shipping in this fandom has been really incestuous. I'm not sure why most of these really weird fans don't just make up their own chipmunk characters instead of shipping the brothers or sisters with each other, but adding more chipmunks to the Alvinnverse would encourage them to use their imagination so that we end up with less Alvin. Anyway, feel free to let me know in the comments your thoughts. Do you think the franchise should just stick to the main 6 Chipmunks and Chipettes? Or do you want to see more members of their species pop up in the current series? If so, how do you think that they should be introduced? What kind of themes should be explored with them? And are there any specific chipmunks from the 80s series like Vinny or the Tweet Tweet tribe that you'd like to see brought back? Don't forget that you're also welcome to leave a like and subscribe if you think I deserve it and want to see more elaborations about topics similar to this. I would also appreciate it if you could share this video with other Alvin and the Chipmunks fans or communities that you may know, as it will help spread awareness of this issue of there being no other chipmunks. If you'd like to chat with me and like-minded fans of this channel more directly, I also have a Discord server linked in the description where you can also get sneak peeks at upcoming videos and suggest new video topics. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.